Hello and welcome back to the Pottery Studio. I'm Wesley and this is BearTracksPottery. Today in the studio I'm going to be making a set of coffee pour-overs. These tend to sell pretty well in my online shop, and people in person will usually walk up to them and say, "Ooh, coffee pour-overs," and then they'll put them back and look at something else. But it's usually best to have a few on hand, and so today I'm going to be making a set of 8 of them. Why 8? Great question. It's just habit. For a while I worked at a studio where the wearboards had space for about 8 of my square bats on them, and even though I don't go there anymore to make my work, I still often will make things in sets of 8. So it's just a habit. There's no logical reason for it beyond that. It's just one of those things that we tend to do. So we've got our bat adhered to our little clay puck there on the surface of the wheel head, and now we're starting to center our clay. I've been trying to make sure that I cone my clay. I think it does help get a reliable center, but I haven't always been very good about doing it. Here we are, pushing that clay into center gently. I say pushing, but really the goal is to sort of turn yourself into an immovable object and let the clay center itself almost. If you're pushing on the clay, you might not be doing it quite right. You may be risking accidentally pushing it out of center as well. I try to usually push very much with my whole body, not just with my arms. And that's how I was taught, and it seems to work. So one of the slightly weird things about making coffee pour-overs is that they have that sort of saucer, that dish, that platter at the base of them. And so where normally you would open the piece right away and sort of start pulling the walls, with the coffee pour-over you actually, or at least when I make them, I will push down a sort of plate section before I open things up, which I've now done. And I'm going to maintain that flat section for the entire rest of the process of making these pour-overs. Here we go. I've forgotten something. I've left my pin tool elsewhere, so I had to stand up, grab it. And I just wanted to measure how thick the base of this pour-over was on the interior. I've had a couple of them not successfully fire because I left the base too thick, which means that it maintains, or retains rather, some moisture. And if you rush things, which I did, whoops-a-daisy, then it has the chance of the piece falling apart in the kiln as the water that's inside the piece still rushes out too quickly, and it actually kind of explodes. It falls apart and can really ruin a bunch of pieces. That actually happened the last time I made a set of pour-overs. I ended up losing 5 or 6 of them in the kiln, and that was a huge bummer. So this time I wanted to make sure that I don't leave too much clay at the base. I want to make sure I use all of that clay. And I think I was pretty successful here. These pour-overs have not yet been fired, but I feel a lot more confident about these, as I was a lot more intentional about getting things nice and even. So for this first one, this is kind of a warm-up piece, and I pulled the walls tall and then slowly widen them out to achieve that cone shape that you need in a coffee pour-over. Here I am, just gradually widening things out, stretching the clay little by little. You can see that it wobbles a little bit as I open things up, and that's normal. It does retain a little bit of that wobble, but it's the kind of thing that you don't really see unless the piece is spinning. If it's sitting still on a tabletop, it's fine. add a little bit of a swirl to the platter base section before I undercut things with my wooden knife tool. And then it's time to cut this off of the bat. And then we'll move on to the next piece once that's done. Very exciting. Well, maybe not very exciting, but it does feel good to get the first piece made successfully. Sets the right tone for the rest of the throwing session. I'm going to carefully peel the bat off of my clay puck and put it over on the shelf before we start the process once again. As I'm sticking this bat to the puck, I'm trying to maintain a consistent pressure across the whole surface of the bat. If you don't do that, the bat can come unstuck, and actually that happened later on in this throwing session after I turned the cameras off, and I ended up having to cut that piece off and start it again later. These things happen if you're not careful and consistent. And pottery is often about being careful and consistent. All right, I've almost got this this lump of clay centered to my satisfaction. Give it a little bit more pressure from above and from the sides before we start the process of turning this piece of unassuming clay into something useful. All right, once again, we're gonna establish our plate, our platter, our saucer. I really don't know what to call it. Is that clear? Because I've given it a name, 3 different names every time I talk about it. Gentle pressure. It's surprisingly easy to get a sort of inconsistency in the width of that flat section, the base. And as you can see, I've got a slight unevenness in my chuck as well. It ends up not affecting the piece too bad, and I know that because I've actually already trimmed these, and they trimmed just fine. They trimmed great. So even though it looks a little funny here on the wheel, it didn't translate into too much instability or wobbliness in the final pieces. Now, as I said in the first one, I pulled the walls up tall and then slowly stretched them out. This time I'm going to try stretching them as I'm pulling the walls up, just to kind of eliminate that extra step. And it can be dangerous to do this. You can, if you're not careful, if you're not gentle, you can accidentally pull too hard too quickly, and that leads to you basically pulling the whole piece off center, and then it's almost unusable. But if you're gentle, you can do it all at once, and that's something I was practicing here on this day. And it worked out. It worked out pretty well. I'm pretty happy with the end result. I've mentioned it before, but this wooden rib is one of my favorite tools. I know all potters have different favorites, and some people really love their plastic or silicone mud ribs, and some people really like the metal ribs, and there are others who always throw with their sponge in their hand. And for me, this wooden rib here, which is just, I think it's just a basic wooden rib you get in every pottery starter set that you can find on the internet or at pottery stores. This is just my favorite tool. All right, let's just get the lip of the pour over finished up a little bit, smooth it out. Add our little swirl there to the base before we add our undercut. And then it'll be time to cut it off the bat. Move on. Snip. Very good. All right, let's throw that on the shelf. Now here I do cut the cameras and I make the rest of the set of pour-overs, but I figured that this time I would try showing the trimming process as well as the throwing process. So that's what we are about to see. Et voila! Blink. It's a new day, and I've got a slightly different lighting setup. Still learning the best ways to film this in my garage studio here, and but it is now time to trim. So I'm gonna get the wheel head wet. This is one of those times where I foolishly decided I was going to try and rush things. I didn't want to take the full time to do everything properly, and you're gonna see the consequences of that decision that I made. But I start out by trying to just use a little bit of moisture on the wheel head to stick the pour over down. I'm gonna bring it back into center. I'm using my fingertips to detect any wobbles and sort of slowly nudge it into center. There are lots of potters who know how to do the tapping. They'll tap the piece into center and they'll just a gentle, and it will eventually sort of ratchet itself into center. And I have practiced this and I've never gotten the hang of it. So instead I use a slower method and it works for me. But it does take a little bit longer. You saw me doing it there. Now for these pour-overs, I trim 2 rings into the foot of the base. One of them is for the outside edge, and that is what helps you make sure that you have the pour-over on the cup that it's going to sit above. And the second one is a smaller inner ring, and that's what you can see me starting to establish now, and that's to help you know that you have the pour-over centered and you're not going to accidentally drip coffee out of the cup and onto your table or your coffee table or wherever you're making your coffee. So you can see here I'm establishing those 2 rings. Got the little trails of trimmed ceramic or trimmed clay snaking off. This is always so satisfying to do, and I think satisfying to watch as well. Those ribbons of clay come off of the tool. Here I'm using a Dolan trimming tool, one of the classics. Really enjoy this tool. Oh, and there we go. So there's what I was talking about, the consequences of my haste. I should have used some clay to tack that down so that it didn't come off, but I was like, nah, I don't need to. I'll be fine. I can hurry it along. And one day I will learn my lesson, but probably not today, and probably not the next time either. I have to be honest. I do often think that it will be fine. I don't need to tack it down, and I often regret it. So I'm gonna stand up. I'm gonna go get some clay to use to tack this piece down. Hold it in place while I'm trimming. to re-wet my wheel head here so that we have a little bit of slip, but hopefully also a little bit of stick. And we're going to recenter, just feeling where the wobbles are, pushing the clay, pushing the piece back to center. Takes a little time, but it's very worth it. And now we will actually tack it down as we probably should have done in the first place, but better late than never, I suppose. No real harm done. We can get back to trimming here. Now I'm just using a metal rib to smooth the outside surface before I just give everything one final pass. Try to bring out any harsh edges, smooth them out. Get the loose trimmings swept away before we finish up this piece. Now, of course, the last thing that a pour over needs are the little holes that let out the coffee once it's brewed. And to do that, I have a little tool here. I actually don't know what they're called. It's a borer, a hole poker. Surely not. But it's got a little piece of brass that you can use to cut holes in pottery. And so I'm going to do that. I have found that 3 of these gives you a good drainage speed and lets the coffee brew well. So I tend to do 3 holes in this pattern here. And I'm happy with that. We'll go ahead and put it back on the shelf. Grab the second pour over to trim as we continue on our merry way. Now this pour over, when I cut it from the bat, I accidentally brushed the edge of that base portion. You can see it a little bit right here on screen right now, actually. And so it has an uneven rim to that base portion of the piece, and that made it a little bit challenging to recenter. It also caused some issues while I was trimming it, and you'll see that here in a few moments. But this time, again, I did learn my lesson from the first piece, and I am going to tack this one down with my lumps of clay. Here we go. Just want it enough that it holds the piece to the wheel head so that it can't slip around. And these really were just the perfect level of moisture to trim. They weren't so dry that they started knocking against the wheel head with vibrations, but they weren't so wet that they were warping and malforming when I worked with them. So it was a joy to trim these today. You can see there's that sort of shudder, that one moment of friction, and that's the point at which the rim of the base was warped. And so you just saw me try to even that out a little bit with my fingers, just gently pull on the clay, and it worked a bit, worked a little. And I'm happy enough with it as it is that I'm ready to start cutting the rings of the foot in now. And I'm just going to do basically the same process as you saw on the first one here. So much about production pottery is about replicability. It's not that you want every single piece to be exactly the same, but you want them to be, well, or at least I guess I should say I want them to be recognizably from the same batch, from the same run. It also helps if you don't have to think too much about what you're going to do, if you just have a system, a process in mind. And if your goal is to make, a certain amount of these things, then it's really helpful to have like a process in mind. And even more so for potters who make it at larger scales than I do, right? I'm just making a set of 8, but there are certainly some potters who would make this on a much larger scale. 10, 20, more even. I heard from one of my early teachers that he would make 50 mugs in a sitting and then trim and handle them in the afternoon. So he'd start his morning off by throwing 50 mugs and then he would finish them in the afternoon. That's crazy to me. That would really take a toll on the body as you're sitting in this position. There are potters who prefer standing wheels. That is a thing. There are people who raise their wheels up so they don't have to be hunched over. I really love using my kick wheel here, and I've got it set up about as ergonomically as I can, but it would be nice if I could maybe lower the seat a little bit or raise the wheel head. So I tend to not work for too long at a time, or it gives me a real crick in my back. Now you might be wondering, what do I do with all of these shavings of clay? And the simple answer is I let them dry out before I put them in a bucket, and I rehydrate them with boiling water. And I will recycle the clay. And actually that table that you see in the background of this shot here is a plaster table, and that plaster will absorb a lot of moisture out of slippy, wet clay. And so I'll rehydrate my clay with boiling water and then pour the slip mud mixture onto that plaster table and let a lot of the water get drawn out of it before I then re-wedge it and use that clay again. And the same thing, I do the same thing with any mistake pieces that fall, that break. As long as it hasn't been bisqued yet, clay can be recycled. So I try to always do that. Makes my purchases of clay from different clay manufacturers last much longer. Once again, I'm using that tool to open up the little holes in the base of the pour over. We're almost done here with this batch. Just one thing left to do after this. Going to add my maker's mark, my stamp here, the BearTracksPottery logo. There it is. And I realized that I'd forgotten to do this with the first pour over that I trimmed, so I go ahead and I'll go back and add that now as well. But folks, that is everything for this day in the studio. Thank you so much for watching, spending a little bit of time with me. I hope y'all have a great day, and I'll see you next time in the studio.